I hope you all remember that wonderful introduction. And I can resolve another problem for you about what is climatology and what is climate science. I was asked to speak to a grade 4 class who were studying the fur trade. And of course, the weather during the fur trade of the Little Ice Age was a very important issue. And the teacher introduced me as a climatologist. And immediately a hand went up at the back of the room. And I said, yes, you got a question? He said, yes. How many mountains have you climbed anyway? "25% of the American population still thinks that the sun goes around the earth, and it doesn't matter to them. It's of no consequence." And this is a very important part of the whole debate here, because for the majority of the public, science is of no direct consequence whatsoever, particularly scientific theories and research and so on. And so when Copernicus became so politically involved because of what he said, and that came out, say the most of the 25% of the American public still don't know that, and they say it's of no consequence. When Newton said there was gravity, people said, as long as I don't fall off, I don't care. They still can't tell you what Newton was all about. And they're not aware that Newton started as a theory and ended up as a law because they had a conference at which they said, it's been a theory long enough, we'll make it a law. See, that's the kind of thinking that goes on. And Einstein, most scientists still can't tell you what Einstein said. So when you start to look at the great scientists of history that have had an impact, the impact is in a very vague way. It's in the history books. It's who somebody after the fact have decided. It's like when you go and read Kepler, and his 3 planetary motions comments are separated by pages and pages of other information. It was only later somebody came and put them all together and gave Kepler the recommendation for it. But things changed when Darwin came along, because, to put it very simplistically, Darwin said, your grandfather's a gorilla. Now he's talking about everybody. Now everybody is directly and emotionally involved in science. And of course, we saw the politics of Darwin and Herbert Spencer's comments about survival of the fittest and so on. So there was a very significant change. And I think it's important to point out that even today, the discussion about Darwin with Richard Dawkins and so on is very much an integral part of this whole debate that's going on. And of course, that also ties into a question that was asked earlier about religion, because once you effectively get rid of God, then you've got to find some other justification for humans being different than all the other animals. And what happened in the academic world was we went from 2 faculties, which were the natural sciences and the humanities, to today, where the largest faculties on campus are the social sciences. And the social sciences are what I call human navel-gazing. It's attempting to explain why humans are different, superior to all the other animals. And there's another whole story of that, but we'll leave it at that point. Next slide. I was asked to a group of engineers, hydrologists, and so on in Calgary, Alberta, wanted to set up a group to oppose the Kyoto Protocol from a science perspective. Of course, they had a huge problem because they were from Calgary and from Alberta. And so they were immediately suspect, plus a lot of them had worked in the oil patch. But they looked at the science behind the Kyoto Protocol. The debate wasn't that they didn't want to set up the society. The debate was how much of their attention should be on the science and how much on the politics. They chose to go 100% with the science. That was a deliberate discussion and choice. The problem is they got very quickly undermined by the politics, because unbeknownst to them, the person that was getting funding for them got $12,000 from an oil company. And when that went out, it didn't matter what they said scientifically. They were dead, absolutely dead in the water. And of course, that's the interesting issue, and Patrick Michaels talked to that. By the way, one of the best arguments that I've heard about the funding is that it doesn't matter who pays you. If your science doesn't hold up, it doesn't matter. That's the real test. It's not who funded it. Yes, there's going to be bias with that, but the real test is in the results. Next slide. This is a graph of the number of students up to the age of 15 in high schools across the world that have scientific skills. You see that all of them are less than 20%. And that's a very, very important part of this whole debate. See, because I taught a science credit for art students. And I knew that if I went into the first class and put a formula on the board, 60% wouldn't be at the second lecture. Okay? And the sad part is, not only are they not scientifically minded, but they're proud about the fact that they can't handle numbers. There's almost a pride in that. And so when you start to talk about climate and climate science and say, oh, well, we've got to pursue the science and show the science is wrong, it's going by choice over the head of 80% of the population. And then if you look at the next part, here's the number of graduates in science and engineering and so on. And you see that even the highest one is still only 30%. So the percentages of students in the academic world indicate this bias of arts and science. Next slide. This is a law faculty at Michigan. And of course, one of the problems I had with my lawsuits was to find a lawyer that could understand the science. All right? And I had some experience because I knew from my own students that went on to law school that most lawyers fail taxation in second year because it's numbers, okay? And so I said to him, how well did you do in taxation? And he said, I was top of the class, I loved it. I said, good, you're my lawyer, right? And it turned out that with his abilities in logic as well as the science, he's been very, very good lawyer for me. If you look over on the next side, you just push the next button, you can see that there's even amongst lawyers, there's only 12% that are in the science faculties. And that's a huge problem in our society today with the climate argument, because we've got the scientists, the lawyers, and the politicians have no idea. Most of them are arts graduates. And so when you go and talk to them about science, that's what Maurice Strong knew. That's why he got the weather agencies in every country involved through the WMO, because he knew they could control the politicians, that if any of the politicians asked questions, they could say, what do you know about the science? How dare you question us? So it put it in the control of the bureaucrats. Next slide. This is a study done at Yale, and it was a study on knowledge about climate change. This is the actual results. And what they did was they graded them, A, B, C, D, and F, and you can see that F is dominant. And here's what they did. Next, there we go. To further adjust for the difficulty of some questions, we constructed a curving grading scale. There's that dreaded grading curve, right? All the students hate, that you're going to put the marks and you're going to curve them so that the performances are determined by the grade. It was lovely for me because, of course, you know, all distributions are a bell curve. So the students would ask me, do you mark on the curve? And I would say, yes, the ball curve. Next slide. Here's the results after they curved the results. How little these people knew that did this study about climate, you understand their problem. Next slide. I had to bring this forward to you. It's been in my file back from the days when I was started and global cooling was the threat. And I wondered how many of the public understood this cartoon? Because you see, it says either the gods are angry or there's been a 0.3% shift in the axis of rotation. It was in the New Yorker, and I never did find out how many people actually understood what this cartoon was. Next slide. Media, few journalists with science training. I found that constantly. They go for sensationalism. Of course, that's no surprise to you. But what's happening now more and more is their own political bias, both their institutional bias and their own personal bias, has become dominant. I refer to the mainstream media as the gossips in the global village. And the gossips, of course, are the people that can destroy a village with false information and false rumor. And of course, the interesting question is, how different would the climate story be without the internet? Because the internet is the last phase of democracy, because control of information has always been the control of powerful groups, and the internet provides virtually everybody access to all the information. They don't necessarily understand it, but it's there, it's available for them. Next slide. The definition of climate change, which of course was the way that the United Nations controlled what they were studying, and it's limited to human causes of climate change. Next slide. The public believes that the IPCC are studying all causes of climate change. And when you read the quote from the IPCC, you understand why. They say the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the leading international body for the assessment of climate change. No, it isn't. That's a false statement, but that's thrown at you all the time. Next slide. The political dilemma, of course, is the politicians face the moral high ground of the question earlier about environment as a religion, because in that vacuum that Darwin created by getting the science using him to get rid of religion, the young people have a moral vacuum, and of course environmentalism came along as a perfect filler for that. And I can tell you, in one of my science credits for art students, I made a deliberately provocative comment. I know you can't imagine me doing that, but I made a deliberately provocative comment. One of the students shouted out, "I don't believe you." Well, of course, the class went rigid. Said the red pencil sword of Damocles is going to descend on him. And I said, "What don't you believe, Thomas?" No, his reply was, "My name isn't Thomas." I then had a discussion with the class about how many of them knew what that reference was. And I pointed out to them that virtually everything in the library was from a Judeo-Christian basis. And whether you agree with that or not, if you didn't understand that, you weren't going to get much out of that library. And so that's a very fundamental part of it. So the politicians, of course, are faced with the lesser of evils. Next slide. Politicians use job and economy, not science, to bypass but not reject the green agenda. That's what's going on. Okay, I've got a sign here to stop, but I've got 2 more minutes. Go next slide. The U.S. Senate voted 95-0 against signing the Kyoto because it was caused severe economic. The next slide, I think, is the most telling one. This is the Prime Minister's Council in India on climate change. He said, would rather save its people from poverty than global warming. That is helping to break that grip of moral high ground that the environmentalists have. That the politicians in the third world countries are saying, hey, we've got much greater priorities. And in fact, the Indian Prime Minister said, you're telling me that it's possible the global temperature could go up 0.5 degree in the next 100 years. But I know that thousands or millions are going to starve. So the priorities have shifted with that. I love the last comment, by the way. India has determined that its per capita greenhouse gas emissions will at no point exceed that of developed countries. That's a political knife. I love that. Next slide. What's going on, though, is behind the scenes, the bureaucrats are controlling things. This is in British Columbia, which was the first province in Canada to bring in a carbon tax. They also introduced smart meters, which is another way of controlling people's energy use. And the person that was mainly responsible for producing this was Andrew Weaver. If you push next slide. And here's what Weaver said about it, and I'll let you read that for yourselves. Weaver, of course, is two things about him. One is he's suing me, as is Michael Mann. And of course, it's not because I'm particularly bright, it's because the public understand what I'm explaining to them. And they can't say I'm not qualified. Weaver's now a member of the Green Party in BC, and of course has been pushing this. The next slide. This is the EPA for, the EPA is doing the same thing. In other words, they are introducing climate controls and climate policies through the bureaucracy. And I'll just leave you with this last quote at the bottom. Can you push the next one? This is Mary McCarthy's comment: bureaucracy, the rule of no one, has become the modern form of despotism. And that's what's going on. So I would suggest to you that, yes, what you're doing with the science is great. What's been achieved through the groups like this is wonderful. But as Sonia intimated, you've really got to get to the political and to the people. And whether we like it or not, we have to acknowledge that Al Gore's movie, Inconvenient Truth, was a superb piece of propaganda. Such a good piece of propaganda that even Lena Riefenstahl would have appreciated it. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Tim. Good job. Okay, we have 6 minutes for questions, so just put your hand up when you have a question. Because to understand how to beat these arguments, you need more than science. And for those of us who are not in school, look up The Science Wars with Stephen Goldman on the internet. Oh, he's ready now.
Hello. President Obama said, the debate is settled, climate change is a fact. The science is irrefutable. Secretary of State Kerry said, the science is unequivocal, and those who refuse to believe it are simply burying their heads in the sand. Those who disagree with climate change are guilty of malpractice. We should not allow a tiny minority of shoddy scientists and extreme ideologues to compete with scientific facts. And those are recent statements from the top of our federal government.
Those, of course, are political statements. One of the things that's happened is that the climate issue has become part of environmentalism, which was a new paradigm shift. And what happens with a paradigm shift is that there's a few people that grab it for either financial or political opportunity, and we saw that with this issue. But what happens is that the extremists, and I've often wondered what their role was, is to define the limits for the rest of us. So environmentalism was a necessary paradigm shift. But most people were saying, well, how far do we go with that? And now what's happening is, because they used it for a political agenda, they're having to make more and more extreme statements about it. And that will eventually bring about the end. One of the things, the comments about the science is settled, the debate is over, is that was first made by Al Gore in his presentation to the US Senate. And of course, interestingly, that raised a lot of questions in the media, because the media said, science is never settled. Why are you saying that? So that was one of the beginning of opening up people's minds, much like the epiphany that Sonia had when she spoke with Houghton, that these people say certain things that suddenly make you stop and say, no, hang on a minute. You know?
Wait a minute, could I have something on
Yes, go ahead.
Because I want to not defend, but explain Obama and his administration. Firstly, he probably didn't write it or even say it. Someone was written for him. It was probably come from the environmental bureaucracy, who have many, many agendas hanging on people believing this. There's the voters. There is the whole hope that this climate stuff will help to encourage investment into renewables, etc., and get the economy going again, which is still in a problematical state. He will get support from many banks and pension funds who've decided to disinvest from carbon. So from a political analysis, not from a scientific one, but from a political analysis, I could not defend, but I could explain Obama's position, because he's only reflecting what's going on in society as a whole. And that so many people believe the Al Gore material. This is a reflection which you hinted at. It's the lack of scientific education in this country and other countries. So you don't blame it all on the politicians either. it's in a sense what happens in politics reflects on all of us.
No, I would agree with that up to a point, but I think one of the great frustrations for the public is the lack of accountability. The people can make these statements and then walk away with them. They're never held accountable for them, and that's the real issue.
But you've got more accountability in this country than in many others. There's no accountability in most countries in the world, and I think America still has more accountability, I think, than many others. So don't put yourself down, you know, but it's a continual fight, a continual process.
Yeah, it seems to me that what we're really lacking here is the fact that we're not willing to go out and shame these people. I mean, these people like Hansen and the people that wrote the speech for Obama, they have to be laughed at until they're just so humiliated with their stupid positions that they must know is a lie. We have to form ourselves, and when we see them, we should spit at their feet.
No, that's going too far. You'll be locked up for that, I think.
Just a quick comment about that. One of the challenges that I've had is that, for example, when I was being interviewed for the Martin Durkin film, The Great Global Warming Swindle, the cameras were running and I wasn't aware of it, and I didn't care afterwards, but he said, have you had any attacks? And I said, yes, I've had several death threats. And the reason that I didn't want to publicize that was because the number of scientists that I knew who were afraid to speak out, and it's the intimidation, and as all of you in this audience know, the price you pay for daring to raise your head in this society, that's what's really frightening. The idea of an open dialogue and an open debate is long gone. And I'd be honest with you. Somebody said, would you do what you did again? And the answer is probably no. The price that you pay is enormous. And I've even had, just to give you an idea, I've had scientists that say to me, we agree with you, but we're socialists. And the minute we say we agree with you, we're categorized as conservatives, and that's a terrible thing to happen.
That is not my experience. That is not.
Maybe
in North America, but I have a good friend who is a member of the Labour Party. He left it, joined the Green Party. He wrote an extremely good paper addressed to the European Commission, criticizing the IPCC. He's a climate skeptic. One of my very good friends who negotiated the Rio conference for the British government is a climate skeptic. He regrets it now that he didn't bring the Treasury along. There is much more openness out there.